My son stood at the head of the conference table, the one I'd sat at for 31 years, and said the words I'd been waiting for him to say. Effective immediately, my father will be transitioning into a purely advisory role. His health concerns have made it clear that Colebrook Construction needs steady, full-time leadership going forward. The room went quiet. 12 faces turned toward me. Board members, project managers, people who'd worked alongside me since before my son was old enough to drive. I watched their expressions shift from surprise to discomfort to something that looked almost like pity. I set down my coffee cup, reached under the table, placed my briefcase on my lap, and let it rest there, closed, while my son kept talking. He didn't know what was inside it. He should have. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been lying in bed at 2 a.m, the way I did most nights since my wife passed. The house felt different with other people in it, and not in the way I'd hoped when I invited my son and his wife to move in after Margaret died. 2 years ago, I told myself it would help. The loneliness was real, and they'd seemed willing enough. My son said they wanted to be close, wanted to help me manage the property, look after things. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. After 31 years of reading contracts and project bids, you'd think I would have gotten better at reading people. That night, a sound pulled me out of a half-sleep. Voices from downstairs, not loud enough to make out words, just the rhythm of it. 2 people talking with the kind of energy that doesn't belong at 2 a.m. unless something's being decided. I got up quietly, the way I'd learned to move in the months after Margaret's diagnosis, when sleep was something I stole in pieces, and every creak of the house might wake her. My feet knew the floor without needing light. The hallway, the top of the stairs, the third step that groaned if you put weight on the left side. I stood in the dark and listened. My daughter-in-law's voice first, lower than usual, focused. The board doesn't know the company's finances the way you do. If you present the health angle correctly, they'll accept it. They don't want drama. They want stability. He's not sick. My son's voice carried that careful quality I'd noticed more and more in recent months. Measured, strategic, words chosen before they were spoken. He doesn't need to be sick. He just needs to seem like he's struggling. The stress of managing a company at 63 after losing his wife. It practically writes itself. People will feel sympathetic. Nobody pushes back on sympathy. A pause. Something set down on the counter. A glass, maybe. The signatures on the transfer documents need to happen before the quarterly meeting, she continued. After that, your majority controller. He keeps his title if he wants. Emeritus, advisory, whatever makes him feel better. But the decision-making is yours. Ours. What about the house? Same process. He signed me onto the household account 2 years ago. We've been managing the utilities, the maintenance. Everything runs through me now. When you're controlling the company assets, the personal assets follow naturally. We're already living here. We just have to make sure we're still living here permanently. I didn't move, didn't breathe the way a person normally breathes. Just stood on the stairs in the dark with my hand on the wall, listening to my son agree that yes, the timing was right. Yes, the board meeting next month was the moment. Yes. His father had been showing signs of confusion lately, hadn't he? He hadn't. I went back to bed, lay in the dark with my eyes open until the sky outside the window turned from black to gray to the flat white of an overcast Tennessee morning. By the time I heard them moving around downstairs, I had already made 3 decisions. The first was that I would not say a word about what I'd heard. Not yet. The second was that I needed to understand exactly what had already happened to my company before I could address what they were planning to do to it next. The third was that I would be ready before they were. My attorney had handled my corporate work since Colebrook Construction's first contract. He was methodical, rarely surprised. And when I sat across from him that morning and laid out what I'd heard, he didn't change his expression. He asked questions in a systematic order, wrote notes in a yellow pad, and when I finished, he leaned back and looked at me for a long moment. How much access does your son have to company accounts? I told him. 3 years ago, I'd added him as a co-signatory to the operating account. A show of trust. Preparation for eventual succession, I'd told myself. An invitation, it turned out. "We need a forensic accountant," he said simply. Before we do anything else, she arrived at his office 2 days later, a small woman with reading glasses and the kind of careful focus that made you glad she was on your side. She asked for 6 months of statements. I gave her 2 years. She worked for 4 days and then called me back in. I sat across from her in that same conference room, and she turned her monitor toward me without preamble. "In the past 22 months," she said, "approximately $340,000 has moved out of Colebrook Construction's operating account through a combination of vendor payments to companies I cannot verify, expense reimbursements that don't correspond to any logged business activity, and transfers to a private account that appears to be held jointly by your son and his wife." She said the number the way professionals do when they've learned to deliver bad news without softening it. Matter of fact. Let the person sitting across from you absorb it at their own pace. I took my time. Thought about Margaret, who had worked beside me for the first 15 years of that company. Thought about the crew we'd built it with. The people who'd stayed through the lean years. The ones who remembered when we were operating out of a single trailer on a job site in Brentwood with 1 truck and a line of credit that made me sweat every month. $340,000 pulled quietly from the thing we'd built. "All of it documented?" I asked. "Every transaction." She turned the monitor back toward herself. "With source accounts, dates, amounts, and destination routing numbers where applicable. You could present this in court tomorrow." I thanked her. She handed me a printed copy in a sealed folder. I put it in my briefcase. My attorney had the corporate documents ready by the following week. He'd reviewed the bylaws carefully and found something that would matter later. My son had signing authority on the operating account, but the corporate structure, the one I'd set up with my first business attorney 31 years ago, still required majority board approval for any changes to executive leadership. That protection had always been there. I had just never needed it before. "They're planning to present this as a voluntary transition," my attorney said. "If they can get 2 or 3 board members to agree before you're in the room, it creates the appearance of a process that's already been decided. How do I prevent that?" He picked up his pen. "You call the meeting yourself. You set the agenda. You control what's discussed and in what order. And you make sure you're the last person to speak." I called the meeting for the 2nd Thursday of March. I sent the agenda through official channels, listed the items in ordinary language: capital planning, project pipeline review, Q1 performance summary. Nothing alarming. Nothing that would cause my son to arrive at that table with his defenses fully raised. In the 3 weeks between that call and the meeting, I watched my son and his wife move through my house with an ease that should have made me angry and instead just made me tired. My daughter-in-law had taken over the kitchen in a way that I hadn't objected to at the time, organizing it to her preferences, buying things without asking. My son sat in my chair in the study most evenings, working on his laptop, looking up occasionally to ask questions about the company that seemed like conversation but felt more like inventory. What's the status of the Henderson contract? When does the Murfreesboro project close out? Who handles the relationship with the city planning office? I answered everything honestly. I had nothing to hide. They needed to believe that. The night before the board meeting, I sat at the kitchen table after they'd gone to bed and went through the briefcase one more time. The financial documents, the corporate bylaws with the relevant sections marked, my attorney's legal summary, a single letter, 2 paragraphs, that I had written myself and had notarized the previous afternoon. I closed the briefcase, set it by the door, and went to sleep. In 31 years of running a company, I'd learned that the most important thing you could do before a difficult meeting was sleep. Margaret used to say I had a gift for that, for putting problems down when nothing more could be done about them until morning. She meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. The boardroom was on the 4th floor of the building I'd owned outright since 2009. My name was on the deed the same way it was on the company's founding documents, the same way it had been on every contract we'd ever signed. I arrived 20 minutes early, set my briefcase under the table beside my chair, and poured coffee from the carafe that our office manager always had ready. Board members arrived in 1s and 2s. People I'd known for years, in some cases decades. I shook hands, asked about families, made the ordinary conversation that precedes ordinary meetings. Nothing in my face told them this wasn't one. My son arrived 8 minutes before the scheduled start. His wife sat in the hallway outside the glass wall, visible through it, watching. She'd positioned herself where she could see the room, but couldn't be asked to leave without making a scene about it. A calculated choice. He sat to my left, as he always did, opened his laptop, glanced at me with the particular expression I'd been watching for weeks, that careful, evaluative look that had replaced something easier and less guarded. I said good morning. He said good morning back. We went through the agenda in order. Capital planning, 20 minutes. Project pipeline, 30. Q1 performance, 15. Everyone spoke who needed to. Numbers were reviewed. Questions were asked and answered. It was an ordinary meeting, indistinguishable from 100 that had preceded it. Then my son cleared his throat. Before we close, he said, with the tone of someone who'd rehearsed the casualness in his voice, I want to address something that I think the board should hear directly from me. Nobody moved. 11 people watched him, the way people watch something when they can sense it matters without knowing yet how much. As most of you know, my father lost my mother 2 years ago, and the demands of running this company, at his age, after that kind of loss, have taken a toll that I think we all recognize, even if we haven't said it directly. He paused, looked at me with an expression arranged to look like concern. Effective immediately, my father will be transitioning into a purely advisory role. His health concerns have made it clear that Colebrook Construction needs steady, full-time leadership going forward. I'll be assuming the role of acting CEO to ensure continuity for our clients and our team. That was the moment. The silence that followed his words, complete and thick and full of people trying to understand what they'd just heard. I picked up my coffee cup, set it down, reached under the table, brought the briefcase up, set it on the table in front of me. The sound of it made 3 people look at my hands. I opened the latches. Slowly. Let them watch. I appreciate that, I said. My voice was the same voice I used on job sites when something had gone wrong and needed to be addressed before it got worse. Steady, not raised. Before the board accepts any changes to executive leadership, there are a few things I'd like to share. I pulled out the first document, set it in the center of the table. This is a forensic accounting report prepared by a certified financial examiner over the past 3 weeks. It documents $340,000 in unauthorized transfers from Colebrook Construction's operating account over the past 22 months. I looked at my son. His color had changed to a joint personal account held by my son and his wife. Nobody breathed. I pulled out the second document, laid it beside the first. This is the corporate bylaw provision that has governed this company since 1994. Section 7, Paragraph 3. Any change to executive leadership requires a majority vote by the full board, properly noticed and conducted in a scheduled meeting. That meeting has not happened. This announcement, made without prior agenda disclosure to the board, has no legal standing. My son's hand moved toward his laptop. I didn't look at it. I pulled out the third document. This is a letter from my personal attorney, copied to the company's outside counsel, notifying this board that I will be pursuing full legal remedies for the misappropriation of corporate funds. Civil recovery proceedings will begin within 10 days, unless the full amount is voluntarily returned with documented accounting. I looked around the table. 12 faces. Shock on most of them. On 1 or 2, the slow recognition of people who were already doing math in their heads, thinking about their own liability, their own signatures, their own positions. My son's voice, when it came, had lost the prepared quality. Dad, that money was, those were expenses. Those were legitimate business. You need to let me explain. I do, I said. You can explain it to my attorney. And then you can explain it to the forensic accountant, whose testimony will be available to the board on request. I turned to the person seated 2 chairs down, a woman who'd served on my board for 8 years and whose judgment I trusted without reservation. I'd like to request a formal vote on whether the board endorses a leadership transition under these circumstances. She looked at my son, looked at me, looked at the documents on the table. I'll second that request, she said quietly. The vote was 11-1. My son voted for himself. He stood up when it was over, the way people stand when they don't know what to do with their hands. His wife was visible through the glass wall, still seated, watching him. I saw the moment the expression on his face told her what had happened. Her face didn't change. She had more practice at not changing her face than he did. "You set this up," he said, not accusatory, more like someone identifying a fact they should have anticipated. I presented evidence to a board that has the authority and the obligation to act on it. That's not setup. That's process. I began returning documents to the briefcase. "You have 30 days to vacate my house. That's standard for Tennessee. I'd recommend using them. Your house." His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager. Something between anger and something younger than that. "We've been living there for 2 years. We've been running the household, managing everything. You were guests," I said. "The same way you were a co-signatory on that account as a professional courtesy, not a transfer of ownership." I closed the briefcase latches. "Both invitations have been withdrawn." Through the glass wall, I could see my daughter-in-law standing now, phone to her ear, her back turned to the room, already making calls, already trying to find the next angle. I had expected that. It didn't change anything. I shook hands with the board members who came around the table to speak with me, listened to their brief and careful expressions of support, their questions about next steps, their concern about client relationships and project continuity. I answered each one directly. The company was stable. The projects were on track. Legal proceedings would be handled quietly and professionally. Nothing would affect the work. When the last board member had filed out, I stood alone in the room for a moment, looking at the table. 31 years of meetings at this table. My wife had sat beside me at the first one, the day we formally constituted the board, 2 months before our first major contract closed. She'd worn a blue jacket and taken notes in a yellow legal pad, and afterward, in the elevator going down, had squeezed my hand and said, "We're really doing this." We really had. In the hallway outside, my son waited. His wife had gone somewhere else in the building, still on the phone. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, and when he heard me, he looked up. "Where are we supposed to go?" he asked. I stopped, considered the question, not the logistics of it, but what he was actually asking beneath the logistics. "That's yours to figure out," I said. "You're 40 years old. You've been drawing a salary from this company for 9 years. You have a wife who is, by her own accounting, excellent at managing resources." I held the briefcase with both hands. "You'll manage. You're not going to..." "What? You're not even going to give me a chance to explain?" "I gave you 9 years of explanations," I said. "Every time the numbers looked unusual, and I asked you about it, I accepted what you told me. Every time I noticed something in the accounts that didn't align with what I expected, I assumed I was missing context." I looked at him directly. "The explanation you want to give me now is the same one you've been giving me for 2 years. I'm not interested in hearing a better version of it." He didn't say anything. His jaw moved once. "The 30 days starts today," I said. "I'll have my attorney send the formal notice tomorrow, but I'm telling you directly so you have the full time. Use it." I walked to the elevator, pressed the button. The building was quiet around me, the ordinary noise of an office in mid-morning, phones and keyboards and someone down the hall laughing at something. The doors opened. I stepped in. The drive home took longer than usual. I went the longer way, through the neighborhood south of the city where Margaret and I had lived when my son was small, streets lined with old trees that were just starting to show green at the edges. I drove slowly. Watched a dog chase a squirrel across a front lawn. Watched 2 kids on bikes cut across an intersection without looking. Watched ordinary life proceeding the way it always did, indifferent to the particular drama of any one person's morning. Back at the house, I walked through each room slowly. My daughter-in-law had altered it in the way that people do when they've decided somewhere is theirs. Furniture rearranged. Decorative objects from my wife's collection moved to make room for different ones. A wall in the hallway repainted a color I hadn't chosen. I stood in the kitchen and thought about Margaret, who had painted that hallway herself, on a weekend in October 15 years ago, who had spent an entire Saturday testing sample squares and asked my opinion on each one, and who had ultimately chosen the color she'd already decided on before asking. I had known that, and loved her for it, and never said so. I made coffee, sat at the table, set the briefcase down beside my chair, and didn't open it again. The next 4 weeks were not quiet. My son's attorney sent 2 letters challenging the forensic accounting findings. My attorney responded to both. My daughter-in-law called 3 times from numbers I didn't recognize, and when I didn't answer, left voicemails that escalated in urgency from apologetic to accusatory to something that sounded like the beginning of a threat before stopping itself. My son tried once more in person. He came to the house on a Thursday afternoon, let himself in with the key he still had, found me in the study. I heard him come in and stayed where I was. He stood in the doorway. He looked tired in a way I recognized. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a battle on multiple fronts simultaneously and is starting to understand that not all of them can be won. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said. I looked up from the document I'd been reading, waited. The money. I know how it looks. But we had expenses. The move. Her father's medical situation. We were in a position where we needed. I thought I could replace it before anyone noticed. He stopped. "I know that sounds like an excuse. It sounds like the truth," I said, which isn't the same as a justification. He was quiet for a moment, looked around the room. His eyes stopped on the photograph on the corner of my desk, the one from 1998, the 3 of us at a job site. He was 11 in that photograph. He thought construction sites were the best places in the world. "She pushed for most of it," he said finally. "Her father's situation. Her family needed the money. She knew how to move it without triggering alerts. She worked the banking side. I knew it was happening. I didn't stop it." He met my eyes. I didn't stop it. I let that sit between us. "The legal process will run its course," I said. "If you cooperate with the accounting review and the recovery proceedings, your attorney can work with mine on terms. If you don't cooperate, it goes to court and becomes a public record." I paused. "That choice is yours. And the company? The board has already authorized a search for an outside CEO. You can apply if you want. I won't interfere with that process one way or the other. Your work record speaks for itself, separate from this." He looked at me like he was trying to understand something, the same expression he'd had as a boy when he was working out a problem from a direction he hadn't expected. "You're not going to yell at me," he said. "No. Or tell me what you think of me. You know what I think of you," I said. "You know what you did, and you know how it reflects on the man I tried to raise. I don't need to describe it to you." He stood for another moment. Then he nodded once, the way people nod when they're accepting something they can't change. He left without saying anything else. I heard the front door close behind him. The house was quiet. Moving day was a Saturday at the end of April. I drove past in the morning and didn't stop, just slowed enough to see the rental truck in the driveway. My son and a friend of his carrying boxes, my daughter-in-law directing things from near the truck with the organizational efficiency she'd always had, turned now toward a different purpose. I went to get coffee, drove around for an hour, came back when the truck was mostly loaded, parked across the street. My son saw my car and set down the box he was carrying. He walked over, stopped at the passenger window, which I lowered. He looked at the house, at the truck, at me. "Her father's debts," he said. "I want you to know, that's really what the money was for. I know it doesn't make it right, but it's the truth." I looked at him, thought about all the things I could say, all the things that were accurate and true and would change nothing. "Take care of yourself," I said. "Learn from this. That's all I want." He stepped back. I raised the window, pulled away from the curb. In my rearview mirror, I watched him stand on the sidewalk for a moment before turning back toward the truck. The locksmith came on Monday. New locks on every door. A security system that my neighbor's son helped me configure. Cameras at the front and back of the property. That evening, I walked through the house slowly, turning lights on and off in each room, listening to the sound of it settling around me. It was too quiet, the way it had been in the months after Margaret died, before I'd made the mistake of filling the quiet with the wrong kind of company. But quiet wasn't the same as empty. I'd learned that the hard way. and now I understood it in a way I hadn't before. The legal proceedings took 3 months to conclude. The recovery agreement required my son and daughter-in-law to repay $340,000 in installments over 5 years, with interest. My attorney considered it a favorable outcome given the alternatives. I signed the agreement in his office on a Tuesday morning and drove afterward to the cemetery where Margaret was buried, something I did occasionally when something significant had been resolved. I sat in the car for a while. The spring had fully arrived by then, everything green and alive and moving in the wind. I thought about what she would have said about all of it. She had always understood people better than I did, had seen through performance faster and forgiven more readily, and held grudges for less time. She would have said something about how grief makes people into different versions of themselves, and how the versions they become aren't always the ones they would choose if they were thinking clearly. She also would have said that none of that excused what my son had done. Margaret was kind, but she was not soft. The new CEO started in July, 44 years old, 15 years in commercial construction management, sharp in the way that people who've worked their way up from crew positions tend to be. On the first day, she walked every active job site before she came to the office. I liked her immediately. I kept a desk in the building, kept my name on the door, came in most mornings and left most afternoons. Advisory, the way it was supposed to work eventually, just not this way and not yet. My son called in August, not from a number I didn't recognize, from his own phone, his name appearing on my screen the way it always had. I let it ring twice, answered on the third. "I wanted you to know I've accepted a project manager position in Charlotte," he said, "with a mid-size residential developer, starting next month." I said that was good to hear. "She and I are separated," he said, "officially, as of last month." I didn't say I wasn't surprised. I also didn't say I was sorry, because the honest answer was complicated and he deserved honesty. "Take it seriously," I said. "The job. Start over and do it the right way. I know." A pause. "I know you don't want to hear this, but I am sorry for all of it." "I believe you," I said. "That's the beginning of something, not the end." We didn't say much more than that, but we stayed on the line for a minute before hanging up, without either of us filling the silence, and that felt like something. That evening, I sat on the back porch as the light went out of the sky over the Tennessee hills, the ones I'd been looking at from this property for 23 years, the ones that didn't change regardless of what happened at ground level. The security light at the corner of the garage blinked green. A bird made noise somewhere in the tree line. Someone down the street was grilling something, and the smell of it drifted over. I thought about the briefcase, sitting inside next to my desk. All those documents that had mattered so much and would matter less with each passing month. Evidence has a shelf life. What you do with what it tells you, that's what lasts. I thought about 31 years of building something from nothing, the work of it, the actual physical work. The early years when I was on site 6 days a week, when my hands knew the difference between good concrete and bad by feel. When I drove home so tired I had to remind myself to signal before turns. I thought about Margaret, who had been there for all of it, who had believed in Colebrook Construction, before there was a Colebrook Construction, who had read every contract in the early years with a sharp pencil in her hand, looking for terms that would hurt us later. Some things, once lost, you don't get back. That was the truth you had to sit with. You did what you could with what remained. The sky went dark. Stars came out. The ones you could see from a place like this, away from the city enough that the dark was actual dark. I stayed on the porch a while longer. There was nowhere else I needed to be.